Traditions and Encounters by McGraw Hill, 4th edition, Chapter 5, Part 2. Free classes. The bulk of the Persian society consisted of free individuals such as artisan, craftspeople, farmers, merchants, and low-ranking civil servants. Priests and priestesses were also prominent in urban residents, along with servants who maintained the temple communities in which they lived. In Persian society, as in earlier Mesopotamian societies, members of the free classes participated in religious observances conducted at local temples, and they had the right to share in the income that temples generated from their agricultural operations and from craft industries such as textile production that the temples organized. The weaving of textiles was mostly the work of women who received rations of grain, wine, beer, and sometimes meat from the imperial and temple workshops that employed them. In the countryside, the free classes included peasants who owned land, as well as landless cultivators who worked on properties owned by the state, temple, communities, or other individuals. Free residents of rural areas had the right to marry and move as they wished, and they could seek better opportunities in the cities or in military service. The Persian empires embraced a great deal of parched land that received little rainfall, and free residents of the countryside contributed much of the labor that went into building and maintenance of irrigation systems. Most remarkable of those systems were underground canals known as quanat, which allowed cultivators to distribute water to fields without losing large quantities to evaporation through exposure to the sun and open air. Numerous quanat crisscrossed the Iranian plateau in the heartland of the Persian Empire, where extreme scarcity of water justified an enormous investment of human labor required to build the canals. Although they had help from slaves, free residents of the countryside contributed much of the labor that went into the excavation and maintenance of the quanat. Slaves. A large class of slaves also worked in both the cities and the countryside. Individuals passed into slavery by two main routes. Most were prisoners of war who became slaves as the price of survival. Other slaves came from the ranks of free subjects who accumulated debts that could not satisfy. In the cities, for example, merchants, artisans, and craftsmen borrowed funds to purchase goods or open shops, while in the countryside, small farmers facing competition from large-scale cultivators borrowed against their property and liberty to purchase tools, seed, or food. Failure to repay those debts in a timely fashion often forced the borrowers not only to forfeit their property, but also to sell their children, their spouses, or themselves into slavery. Economic foundations of classic Persia. Agriculture was the economic foundation of classical Persian society. Like other classical societies, Persia needed large agricultural surpluses to support military forces and administrative specialists, as well as residents of cities who were artisans, craft workers, and merchants rather than cultivators. The Persian empires embraced several regions of exceptional fertility, notably Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, and northern India, and they prospered by mobilizing the agricultural surpluses of those lands. Agricultural production. Barley and wheat were the grains cultivated most commonly in the Persian empires. Peas, lentils, mustard, garlic, onions, cucumbers, dates, apples, pomegranates, pears, and apricots supplemented the cereals in diets throughout Persian society, and beer and wine were the most common beverages in most years. Agricultural production far exceeded the needs of cultivators, making sizable surpluses available for sale in the cities or for distribution to state servants. Through the imperial bureaucracy, vast quantities of produce flowed into the imperial court from state-owned lands. Even though they were incomplete, surviving records show that in 500 BCE, during the middle period of Darius's reign, the imperial court received almost 800,000 liters of grain, quite apart from vegetables, fruits, meats, poultry, fish, oil, beer, wine, and textiles. Officials distributed some of this produce to the imperial staff as wages in kind, but much of it also found its way into the enormous banquets that Darius organized for as many as 10,000 guests. Trade. Agriculture was the foundation of the Persians' economy, but long-distance trade grew rapidly during the course of the Persian empires and linked lands from India to Egypt in a vast commercial zone. Each region of the Persian Empire contributed particular products to the imperial economy. From the gold and ivory of India to the semi-precious stones of Iran, and from the metals and of Anatolia to the textiles and grain of Egypt. Several conditions promoted the growth of trade. The relative political stability maintained by the Persian empires, the general prosperity of the realm, the use of standardized coins, and the availability of good trade routes, including long-established routes newly constructed to highways such as the Persian Royal Road, and sea routes through the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Arabian Sea. Markets operated regularly in all the larger cities of the Persian empires, and the largest cities such as Babylon were home to banks and companies that invested in commercial ventures. Long-distance trade of this sort became especially prominent during the reigns of Alexander of Macedon and the Seleucid successors. The cities they established and the colonists they attracted stimulated trade throughout the whole region from the Mediterranean to northern India. Indeed, Greek migrants facilitated cultural as well as commercial exchanges by encouraging the mixing and mingling of religious faiths, art styles, and philosophical speculation throughout the Persian realm. I am going to, in case you want to pause the videos to read this about reverberations. And moving on, religions of salvation in classical Persian society. Cross-cultural influences were especially noticeable in the development of Persian religion. Persians came from the family of peoples who spoke Indo-European languages, and their earliest religion closely resembled that of the Aryans of India. During the classical era, however, the new faith of Zoroastrianism emerged and became widely popular in Iran, and to a lesser extent also in the larger Persian empires. Zoroastrianism reflected the cosmopolitan society of the empires, and it profoundly influenced the beliefs and values of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Zarathustra and his faith. The earliest Persian religion recognized many of the same gods as the ancient Aryans, and their priests performed sacrifices similar to those conducted by the Brahmins In India, like the Aryans, the ancient Persians glorified strength and marital virtues, and the cults of both peoples sought principally to bring about a comfortable material existence for their practitioners. I will zoom in on that. Feel free to read that or pause the video. Zarathustra. During the classical era of Persian religion underwent considerable changes as moral and religious thinkers sought to adapt their messages to the circumstances of a complex cosmopolitan society. One result of Zoroastrianism, which emerged from the teachings of the Zarathustra through Zarathustra, was undoubtedly a historical person. Little certain information survives about his life and career, and is not even clear when he lived, though most scholars date his life to the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE. He came from an aristocratic family, and he probably was a priest who became disenchanted with the traditional religion. In any case, when he was about 20 years old, Zarathustra left his family and home in search of wisdom. After about 10 years, he experienced a series of visions and became convinced that the supreme God, whom he called Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, had chosen him to serve as his prophet and spread his message. The Gathas. Like his life, Zarathustra's doctrine remains largely unknown, since many of the earliest Zoroastrian teachings were not preserved in writing. Only during the Seleucid dynasty did Zoroastrian priests known as Magi begin to preserve religious texts in writing, and only under the Sassanids did they compile their scriptures in a holy book known as the Avesta. Nevertheless, many Zarathustra's own compositions survive because of the diligence by which Magi preserved them through oral transmission known as the Gathas. Zarathustra's works were hymns that he composed in honor of various deities that he recognized apart from the Gathas. Ancient Zoroastrian literature include a wide variety of hymns, liturgical works, and treatises on moral and theological themes. Though some of these works survive, the arrival of Islam in the 7th century CE and the subsequent decline of the Zoroastrianism resulted in the loss of most of the Avesta and later Zoroastrian works. Zoroastrian teachings. Zarathustra and his followers recognized Ahura Mazda as a supreme deity and the creator of all good things. But the Zarathustra also praised 6 lesser deities in the Gathas. Furthermore, he believed that Ahura Mazda engaged in a cosmic conflict with an independent adversary, an evil and malign spirit, known as Angra Mainya, often also referred to as Aharam, the destructive spirit or hostile spirit. Following a struggle of some 12,000 years ago, Zarathustra believed Ahura Mazda and the forces of good would ultimately prevail, and Angra Mainya and the principle of evil would disappear forever. At that time, individual human souls would undergo judgment and would experience rewards or punishments they deserved. Zarathustra did not call for ascetic renunciation of the world in favor of a future heavenly existence. On the contrary, he considered the material world a blessing that reflected the benevolent nature of Ahura Mazda. His moral teachings allowed human beings to enjoy the world and its fruits, including wealth, sexual pleasure, and social prestige, as long as they did so in moderation and behaved honestly toward others. Zoroastrians have often summarized their moral teachings in the simple formula: good words, good thoughts, good deeds. Popularity of Zoroastrianism. Zarathustra's teachings began to attract large number of followers during the 6th century BCE, particularly among Persian aristocrats and ruling elites. Wealthy patrons donated land to and established endowments for the support of Zoroastrian temples. The Achaemenid era saw the emergence of a sizable priesthood whose members conducted religious rituals, maintained a calendar, taught Zoroastrian values, and preserved Zoroastrian doctrine through oral transmission. Beginning with Darius, the Achaemenid emperors closely associated themselves with the Ahura Mazda and claimed divine sanction for their rule. Darius ordered stone inscriptions celebrating his achievements, and in those monuments he clearly revealed his devotion to Ahura Mazda and his opposition to the principle of evils in one of his inscriptions. Darius praised Ahura Mazda as the great god who created the earth, the sky, and humanity, and who moreover elevated Darius himself to the imperial honor. With the aid of imperial sponsorship, Zoroastrian temples cropped up throughout the Achaemenid realm. The faith was most popular in Iran, but it attracted sizable followings also in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Egypt, and other parts of the Achaemenid Empire. Even though there was no organized effort to spread it beyond its original homeland. I am going to close in on this. Sources from the past. Feel free to pause so that you may read this for further reflection. Religions of salvation in a cosmopolitan society. The arrival of Alexander of Macedon inaugurated a difficult era for the Zoroastrian community. During his Persian campaign, Alexander's force burned many temples and killed numerous magi. Because at that time the magi still transmitted Zoroastrian doctrines orally, an untold number of hymns and holy verses disappeared. The Zoroastrian faith survived, however, and the Parthenons cultivated it to rally support against the Seleucids. Officially sponsored Zoroastrianism. During the Sassanid dynasty, however, Zoroastrianism experienced a revival, as self-proclaimed heirs to the Achaemenids. The Sassanids identified closely with Zoroastrianism and supported it zealously. Indeed, the Sassanids often persecuted other faiths if they seemed likely to become popular enough to challenge the supremacy of Zoroastrianism. With generous imperial backing, the Zoroastrian faith and the Magi flourished as never before. Theologians prepared written versions of the holy text and collected them in the Avesta. They also explored points of doctrine and addressed difficult questions of morality and theology. Ordinary people flocked to Zoroastrian temples, where they prayed to the Ahura Mazda and participated in rituals. The Zoroastrian faith faced severe difficulties in the 7th century CE when Islamic conquerors toppled the Sassanid Empire. The conquerors did not outlaw the religion altogether, but they placed political and financial pressure on the Magi and the Zoroastrian temples. Some Zoroastrians fled their homeland and found refuge in India, where their descendants, known as Parsis, Persians, continue even today to observe Zoroastrian traditions. But most Zoroastrians remained in Iran and eventually converted to Islam. Only a few thousand faithful maintain a Zoroastrian community in modern day Iran. Other faiths. Meanwhile, even though Zoroastrianism ultimately declined in its homeland, the cosmopolitan character of the Persian realm offered opportunities to influence other religions' faiths. Numerous Jewish communities had become established in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Persia after the Hebrew kingdom of David and Solomon fell in 930 BCE. During the Seleucid, Parthian, and Sassanid eras, the Persian Empire attracted merchants, emissaries, and missionaries from the whole region between the Mediterranean and India. Three religions of salvation, Buddhism, Christianity, and Manichaeism, all discussed in later chapters, found a footing alongside Judaism and attracted converts. Indeed, Christianity and Manichaeism became extremely popular faiths in spite of intermittent rounds of persecution organized by the Sassanid authorities. Influence of Zoroastrianism. Jews living in Persia during the Achaemenid times adopted several specific teachings of Zoroastrianism, which later found their way into the faiths of Christianity and Islam as well. These teachings included the notion that an omnipotent, potent, and beneficent deity was responsible for all creation. The idea that a purely evil being worked against the Creator God, the conviction that forces of goodwill ultimately prevail over the forces of evil after a climatic struggle, the belief that human beings must strive to observe the highest moral standards, and the doctrine that the individuals will undergo judgment, after which the morally upright will experience rewards in paradise, while evildoers will suffer punishments in hell. These teachings, which have profoundly influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all derived ultimately from the faith of Zoroaster and his followers. This is the end of chapter 5, part 2. But I will zoom in on the summary should you wish to go through this.